website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio. Today we're going to be having a titillating discussion about solar flares, geomagnetic storms, and well, we're going to go over this complete science and history of everything we know about these large events, these geomagnetic storms that hit Earth during the Holocene. Now, the most recent one many of you have heard about, and it is the Carrington event, and because it's the most discussed. So let's get on with the program. Now, solar flares, coronal mass ejections. This is when large plasma ejections come from our sun and get ejected into space. The only time they're dangerous is when they're shot at or towards Earth. You can get a glancing blow or a direct hit. Now, large solar storms could knock out the power grid, the internet, or if it's large enough, even send us back into the Stone Age. So that is the topic of discussion for today. So welcome to the show, whether it be morning or evening, wherever you're at. And for those that are new to the radio show, if you're listening on Revolution Radio, it is the #1 listener-supported internet radio. So please, if you can support them there, they give us this platform. So it's important that we all do our part and keep this radio platform alive. Second, there is a chat feature at Revolution Radio that I look at during the radio show. So if you're listening live on Revolution Radio, you can get into the chat and ask me questions during the show. So that might be an option for you. We are live at noon Mountain Time every Saturday. So just do the adjustment if you want to watch that live and chat with me in the Revolution Radio chat room. So let's get on with the program about large solar storms and their potential effect on humanity. And so this is a very interesting topic. So let's just start with the most obvious solar geomagnetic storm, the big one that we all know about, the Carrington event. Back on September 1st and 2nd of 1859, telegraph systems around the world failed catastrophically. The operators of the telegraphs reported receiving electric shocks, telegraph paper catching fire, and being able to operate equipment with batteries completely disconnected. During the evenings, the aurora borealis, more commonly known as the Northern Lights, could be seen as far south as Colombia. Now, that's in South America. Typically, these lights are only visible at high latitudes, and most of you know that because most of you that don't live in the aurora zone have never seen them. And so the aurora zone is like northern Canada and Scandinavia, even Siberia. But the aurora was visible down to the equator. And what the world experienced that day was known as now the Carrington event, which is a massive geomagnetic storm. Now, these geomagnetic storms occur when a large bubble of superheated gas called plasma is ejected from the surface of the sun and hits the Earth. And then when it hits the Earth, we measure it in the KP index. Now, the bubble is also known as a coronal mass ejection. Now, the plasma of a coronal mass ejection consists of a cloud of protons and electrons, which are electrically charged particles racing towards Earth. And when these particles reach the Earth, they interact with the magnetic field that surrounds the planet. This interaction causes the magnetic field to distort and weaken, which in turn leads to the strange behavior of the aurora borealis and other natural phenomenon. So these geomagnetic storms can cause power and internet outages and could even fry the grid. Now, the Carrington event of 1859 is the largest recorded account of a geomagnetic storm in recent memory, but it's not an isolated event, and we've talked about other events. There have been geomagnetic storms recorded since the early 19th century, and scientific data from Antarctic ice core samples have shown evidence of even more massive geomagnetic storms. And we're going to get into all of them. And all of these breakthroughs are coming out just in the last decade. And the most recent paper just coming out added the largest event in the Holocene. Now we know that a massive geomagnetic storm occurred around AD 774, and it's known as the Miyake event or the Charlemagne event. And until just recently, that solar flare produced the largest and fastest rise in carbon-14 ever recorded. These geomagnetic storms trigger high amounts of cosmic rays in Earth's upper atmosphere, which in turn produce the carbon-14, which is a radioactive isotope of carbon. Now, a geomagnetic storm, 60% smaller than the Charlemagne event or the Miyake event, occurred around AD 993. And ice core samples have shown evidence that large-scale geomagnetic storms with similar intensities as the Miyake and the Carrington event occur quite often at a rate of maybe 500 years or less. Now remember that the Miyake event was 100, if not 1,000 times bigger than the Carrington event. So there's a wide range of possibilities. And nowadays, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration use geomagnetic storm scales to measure the strength of solar eruptions and the subsequent geomagnetic storm on Earth. The G scale has a rating from 1 to 5, with G1 being minor and G5 being extreme. Now, the Carrington event would have been rated G5, and it gets even scarier when you compare the Carrington event with the Miyake event. Now, scientists were able to estimate the strength of the Carrington event based on the fluctuations of Earth's magnetic field, as recorded by observatories at the time. But there's no way to measure the magnetic fluctuations of the Miyake event. Instead, scientists measured the increase in carbon-14 in tree rings from that time. And the Miyake event produced a 12% increase in carbon-14. By comparison, the Carrington event produced less than 1% increase in carbon-14. So the Miyake event likely dwarfed the G5 Carrington event. I think that's incorrect, the way they said that. I am reading an article here. So 14%. Let's go over that again. Yeah. There was a 12% increase in carbon-14 during the Charlemagne event and less than 1% for the Carrington. That means that the Charlemagne event back in 774 AD was likely 14 times or more bigger than the Carrington event. And then we've got this paper just coming out. Let's see what the date is here. And it's got some amazing graphics. So I implore you all to Google this in your Googler. Cosmogenic radionucleotides reveal an extreme solar particle storm near a solar minimum 9125 years before present. And this is a January 11th, 2022 paper. So it came out earlier this year. And it's about a year old. Now, analysis of radioactive chemicals in ice cores indicate that one of the most powerful solar storms to ever hit Earth that we know of happened 7176 BC. For a few nights more than 9,000 years ago, at a time when many of our ancestors were wearing animal skins and recovering from the Younger Dryas event, the northern skies would have been bright with flickering lights. Telltale chemical isotopes in ancient ice cores suggest that one of the most massive solar storms ever to take place occurred 7176 BC, and it would have been noticed by everyone on the planet. We know that most high-energy events are accompanied with major geomagnetic storms. So it's likely there were visible auroras worldwide. Now that's a heck of a solar storm. The event created distinctive radioactive varieties of beryllium and chlorine in the atmosphere. And those isotopes then fell to the ground with the yearly seasonal snowfall and were preserved in the layers of ancient ice. The cause was almost certainly a solar storm of protons and electrons and ions. These are called solar energetic particles, or SEPs. Now, although galactic gamma ray bursts and supernovas would have left a similar chemical signature in the ice, the most likely source is the sun. And researchers have now examined ice cores from several drilling projects in Greenland and in Antarctica, which is a very difficult and time-consuming task. And in ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica, they saw evidence of 3 SEP events. And so now we're adding more and more of these large geomagnetic storms to our historical knowledge. And so now, corroborated by ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, we know that there have been major solar storms 10 times or greater than the Carrington event in 993 AD or 994 AD, in AD 774 or 775, which is the Miyake event, the Charlemagne event, and another one in 660 BC, and all are associated with solar storms. And now we find evidence of another large geomagnetic storm event, or SEP event, unrecorded until now, that occurred 9,200 years ago, and to be specific, 7176 BC. And because its strength could be estimated by the levels of radioactive isotopes of beryllium and chlorine, scientists have determined that the solar storm of 7176 BC was so severe that if a similar intense storm happened today, it would have catastrophic consequences, including knocking out satellites in orbit, hundreds of them, destroying communications networks, and blacking out the entire electric grid. And that would be a serious situation, and it would happen in an instant. 8 to 12 hours after the sun's outburst, it would already have arrived. Now, the known events of the last 70 years, where we have instrumental data, have all been much smaller. And these ancient events are at least 10 times larger than any of the events that have occurred in the last 70 years, including, I believe, an X45 solar flare that happened within the last 2 decades. And we'll go over that in the second half of the program. Now, the researchers say a puzzling feature of the 7176 BC solar storm is that it occurred during a supposedly quiet phase of the sun, known as solar minimum. And they were able to look at the 11-year solar activity cycle to determine this. And during solar minimum, if you follow the channel Oppenheimer Ranch Project or Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube, you know that there's little solar activity during solar minimum, and typically not a lot of geomagnetic storms. Those happen during solar max, during the 11-year cycle. But solar physicist Dean Pesnell of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, who was not involved in the study, calculated the 7176 BC storm occurred not during the actual solar minimum, but at the beginning or start of the new solar cycle, which has already passed for us, and that's good news. And if the solar storm did not happen during the solar minimum, but instead occurred at the start of a new cycle, it would undermine the researchers' warning that such storms can happen at that time and are not being properly accounted for. So this is quite interesting. And if we bring up the paper, which you guys can't see on the radio, they have an interesting graph that's so specific with this beryllium spike happening at that very specific time and being corroborated in 2 locations. And then here you can see, if you're watching on the YouTube, the solar cycles on the bottom and when this occurred. So these major events may be occurring during the solar minimum or the rise up in the new cycle. And that was the determination from the paper. So the relationship between the solar 11-year cycle and the occurrence of huge solar energetic particle events of 9125 years before present and even 774 CE are showing up at different times during the solar cycle, but mostly during the minimum. The 774 event was on the down drop of the cycle towards the bottom of the minimum within 2 years of the minimum. And the 9125 year before present event happened just on the rising cusp of the new cycle. So all of the big events seem to be happening at the bottom of the cycle, which means that if we're going to have a big event here on planet Earth, it's going to happen between 2028 and 2032, which would be at that bottom between solar cycle 25 and 26. So even closer, it would be 2029 to 2031. And that's when we would have to be looking out for a major event, a major solar storm, 10 times bigger than the Carrington event. Now, not only do these major solar storms bring, beautiful celestial lights in the form of aurora borealis, but they're also going to charge the Earth, the telluric currents in the Earth. These events may drive what's happening at the core on Earth, and that may cause the Earth to grow potentially along mid-ocean ridges. So there could be huge geophysical consequences to these giant geomagnetic storms. And we know that climatically, if we go back to the 9100 event here, that the temperature dropped precipitously. We're looking at a Holocene temperature graph if you're listening on the radio. And it shows a 3 degrees C temperature drop that lasted for 700 years after the 9100 event. And there are similar cooling effects from other large geomagnetic storms. And the reason could be is because the amount of cosmic rays entering, and it gets cloudy, but these events only last for short periods of time, yet the climatic effect is lasting. So one of the suppositions here is that during these major geomagnetic storms, when huge amounts of energy are entering the poles, it may cause massive ice loss because of heating. And then that fresh water shuts down thermohaline cycles in our oceans, causing mini ice ages. Just like the shutdown of the AMOC will occur, if that were to occur, there would be a mini ice age in Europe. The temperatures would plummet. So there are a lot of considerations to think about if one of these events were to happen. Now, according to astronomers, the sun is still capable of monstrous superflares. Well, why wouldn't it be? And according to these astronomers, satellite-destroying X-flares from our own sun are likely to occur only once every 250 to 350 years. So, and for the present sun, astronomers estimate about 1x100 solar flare every 300 years. And a solar flare 10 times larger than that happening once every 18,000. These are all statistics and they mean very little, because at any moment the sun could flare in a very big way. Now, did you know that our sun rotates on its axis once every 25.3 days? And according to these astrophysicists, so-called, they say that as a rule, the older the star is, the slower they rotate and the less they flare. And they said that because of our sun is well known to be 4.5 billion years old and rotating quite slowly, that it's very unlikely to flare. This is not based on any known factual information. This is all conjecture. It's been proven that plasma physicists know nothing about the sun. If we just go back to during solar cycle 24, as we were entering solar cycle 24, 99% of all plasma physicists were incorrect in predicting the magnitude of solar cycle 24. 99% missed it. They said solar cycle 24 was going to be a huge solar cycle, and it was the weakest solar cycle in almost 200 years. And then they said the same thing about solar cycle 25. It's going to be the biggest in history. And solar cycle 25 is one of the weakest solar cycles. It's mimicking solar cycle 24. We'll just pull up the solar cycle comparison, and you can see for yourself. It is mimicking cycle 24 here. It is not even comparable to 21, 22, or 23. They're all twice or three times larger than cycle 25. So, and once again, as recently as a few months ago, there are articles coming out that are claiming that this cycle is the strongest that anyone has ever seen, which is the exact opposite of what the data shows us. But that shouldn't surprise you, because almost everything that you read in the mainstream media and in mainstream science, almost all of it is 100% the opposite of what is actually the truth. And especially when it comes to quote unquote climate science. But what's the point of them lying about this being the strongest solar cycle? What is the point of that when it's one of the weakest? It's anyone's guess why they are pulling the wool over our eyes about the truth. And in the second half, we're going to be talking about some of the biggest solar flares that we've ever witnessed and what the consequences may be. So stay tuned for more Boom.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There was blood on the wire.
Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance. People under fire. Children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at buyer risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second half of Cosmic Catastrophe. We have been discussing some of the largest solar storms in history, and the fact that we've just been scientifically uncovering these, and the fact that we once thought that maybe they were very infrequent. We're now becoming quite privy to the fact that these geomagnetic storms happen more often than we thought. And each and every year that goes by, we discover more and bigger solar energetic particle events. So what does that mean for the future of humanity? It is bleak. It means that the powers that be are not telling you the truth. The truth is that the infrastructure we've built, the computer networks, the electrical systems, they are all doomed to fail at some point in the future. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when at this point. And it has been over 160 years or more since the last even slightly significant solar storm. That was the Carrington event, hit Earth. And we haven't seen anything like it since. Well, we actually have, and we'll go over that in just a moment. We've actually had major X flares blast off the sun that we witnessed. The good news is that they didn't come towards Earth. They were shot away from Earth. And so we've witnessed this in recent times. And one of the largest solar flares is the mega flare of November 4th, 2003. It was so big that scientists, well, they didn't know how to measure it because it didn't come directly at Earth. Had it come directly at Earth, it would have been, well, I wouldn't be making this video. The amount of radiation produced from this event, which when you look at it on video, looks quite insignificant, would have literally sent us back to the Stone Age in 2003. And if it had been Earth-facing in 2003, and we were back in the Stone Age, right now in 2020, the population on Earth would be probably around 500 million or less. Just like the Georgia Guidestones once posited. Now, this event happened in 2003, and it will happen again. November 4th, 2003, the largest solar flare ever witnessed, an X45, occurred after the sunspot rotated around the limb. And so this will happen again. Yep. So the X45 solar flare, the 4th of November, 2003, is the largest solar flare ever witnessed. And had that been Earth-facing, we would not have a YouTube. We would not have a grid. Be like, you know, almost 20 years later, who knows how we would have built up from, how society would have built itself up. It would be a Mad Max world, no matter how you look at it. Our sun is an active star. It emits solar flares all the time. We get geomagnetic storms all the time, but they usually do little harm. A new study revealed that there's a chance, however small, that the sun could unleash a dangerous superflare, potentially at any moment, with a high probability in the next 100 years. And by examining our sun and stars out in the galaxy, astronomers have determined that stars like our sun typically start off very active as they rapidly rotate after forming. That's nonsense. We don't believe that here on the channel. We believe in the plasma universe theory and ideology, and that suns are not born. They're not thermonuclear engines that burn out at some point and then supernova. Stars are nothing more than Z-pinches on Birkeland currents. And then these Z-pinch stars can shoot out planets and other stars. So According to NASA's astronomer Rachel Ostin, if the strongest flare ever recorded from the sun, as seen on November 4th, 2003, was classified as an X45 flare, that would be the one that sent us back to the Stone Age. A super flare would be classified as X100,000. Did you hear that? The X45 flare back on November 4th, 2003, that would have sent us back to the Stone Age, pales in comparison to a super flare, which could happen in our lifetime. And a super flare would be classified as X100,000, which would eclipse a micronova, if you've heard that nomenclature. So the question is, do we even need the term micronova? We do not. Because you can just classify the event as on the X scale as a super flare. And super flares do occur. We now know that there have been super flares at least 4 times in the past, or Miyake events. And we've gone over them. We've got 993 AD, just 1,000 years ago, we had a super flare. It has everything to do with the Dark Ages back then. And then we have the 774 AD, also during the Dark Ages or the Charlemagne event, and 660 BC, all super flare events. We also have the biggest one ever recorded 9,200 years ago, or the 7176 BC event. And then we have the pathetic little Carrington event, which is, 20 times weaker than these events. And the potential for a super flare, 100,000 times bigger than the Carrington event. Now, I can assure you that there would be some other issues on Earth other than aurora and a fried grid if a solar flare of that magnitude were to come at Earth. People's physiological bodies wouldn't be able to handle it. The amount of radiation on the surface during the storm hitting would be insane. Maybe there would be ionospheric lightning, and other phenomenon that we cannot even describe. Lightning coming from space. So anyone on the surface would surely be fried. And these are all considerations we need to make about surviving potentially one of these events. We're showing you the size of the sunspots that created the X45 flare. And they're not that big. If you watched our Legend of the Three-Legged Crow video, that sunspot covered 1/3 of the sun. But the X45 sunspot on November 4th, 2003, not that large. Maybe 1/20th the diameter of the sun in width. Just a normal solar max picture. And then boom, the end of the empire. And because of technology, we're going to be watching the sunspot move across the sun before it flares. We're going to know that this potentially could happen before it happens. But is the planet ready? No. Not at all. The planet is not ready. How will we safeguard the Earth from a solar storm catastrophe? Well, we're trying. We haven't been trying hard enough. The U.S. government recently allocated a few $1 million, I believe, to hardening the grid. But that's certainly not enough. The problem is if the entire grid were to fail, there would be no infrastructure set up if there's no electricity to make more stuff to fix the grid. You have to start back at scratch. But there are new efforts that could protect power stations against an EMP attack. But that's certainly not an X 100,000 solar flare. You cannot protect from that. And it's happened in the past, so humans knew to go underground. And maybe that's why the whole idea that we were once cavemen has a much deeper meaning. Maybe after being on Earth for 100,000 plus years, Homo sapiens realized that every now and again, events occur that if you're not in a cave or underground, you are not going to make it. And even small events could affect us in a big way. And there's a very high probability that an X-20 or 10 directed at Earth could happen at any time. A geomagnetic storm of this nature, triggered by a burst of solar energy, could overwhelm the nation's power grid, shut down cell towers, communication networks. And similarly, we have now, unfortunately, nations around the world, human-built electromagnetic pulse weapons that could temporarily wipe out the networks that connect us and sustain us as well. From the fabric of the global economy to families planning tonight's dinner, we rely on these communication networks and the power grid that underlies them. They are all woven more tightly through our lives than ever before. And all these networks could be gone in a flash. And we have a nation built on staring into squares. The psychological effects on children and young adults, because they cannot connect to their fake world, would be devastating. The psychological effect would be much worse than the power outage alone. And just within 72 hours, large swaths of the population would be dead. If you live in a major city, at some point, the criminal elements are going to realize that the lights aren't coming back on, and the looting begins. And if you don't have a way to protect yourself or your family, you will be a victim in a very short period of time. Which is why many preppers implore that you have a bug out plan, especially if you live in a major city. Even the possibility of a grid down scenario, you pick up everything and go immediately. You want to be as far away from populated areas as possible. Not only for the criminal element of people coming to take your things, but the fact that a big enough solar flare not only will knock out the grid, it will light the infrastructure on fire. This brings us full circle from the beginning of the podcast when we were discussing the Carrington event and the telegraph workers and the telegraph paper lit on fire. And the workers were electrocuted and they couldn't turn off the equipment even if they unplugged it. There was such a limited electronic infrastructure in 1859. The effects of a major geomagnetic storm on planet Earth are incomprehensible. The powers that be are not warning you about it because this scenario is unimaginable. And all it would lead to is, well, global panic, fear. But experts are not taking this lightly, trust me. The powers that be we all know about deep underground military bases. All the missing trillions of dollars. More trillions are now missing. It's not missing. It's going for secret underground operations that world governments are funding by stealing our tax dollars. and misappropriating it so that they can make it, not so we can make it. Now, occasionally the sun unleashes pent-up energy in the form of a solar flare or coronal mass ejection, and we report on them regularly on our channel, where we do space weather updates on Oppenheimer Ranch Project. Sometimes we do them over at Magnetic Reversal News, and I implore you to go and subscribe at YouTube to both of those channels. We use telemetry and satellite data. It helps us predict these solar eruptions. But there are still plenty of questions about how the sun works, which is why we watch it every day, to learn more. And if we could answer some of these questions, it would improve forecasts for space weather. And the US government and the ESA are putting up more and more probes into space to monitor the sun, because they are very well aware of everything I just talked about. And now we have other worries. Earth's magnetic field, our magnetosphere. It protects us against the sun's fire hose of energy as this coronal mass ejections get shot at us. And our magnetosphere has been weakening since the Carrington event. Can you imagine that? And it's also been wandering. So it's going to be easier and easier for the sun to overpower our natural planetary defense. When that happens, solar radiation can heat up the upper atmosphere and charge it with electricity, which we know causes auroras at the North and South poles. But if we were to multiply that by 100 or 1,000 or 100,000, the effects would be unimaginable. So the way it rolls out is when a major solar flare blasts off the sun and heads towards Earth, the coronal mass ejection typically arrives about a day later. And then it interacts with and dramatically changes Earth's magnetic field. The Earth's atmosphere's uppermost layer is already warmer, and now it's battling a cloud of plasma that creates currents in the atmosphere and on the ground. And this could lead to ionospheric lightning, massive lightning from the ground into the ionosphere or space. We already know what the red sprites and the jets look like, but this would be a much more energetic lightning. Lightning like no one has ever seen. And the moment the CME reaches the poles, that's when the power grid starts to feel things. When you create a giant current in the ionosphere, you create currents in the ground. The power grid is anchored in the earth and is grounded. In the worst case scenario, a CME would literally fry all the equipment on Earth. And all that equipment would need to be replaced before you could bring power back to the grid. And if you had no power, because the entire infrastructure is fried, then you have no timeline to get it back and up and running. Square one, literally, Stone Age. If this happens now without warning, the results will be catastrophic. Power plants, substations, and transmission lines for entire cities or regions could be fried. People might be without power in a small event for days or weeks, months or years in a larger event. And then you have food shortages and untold crises. The effect on the economy would be devastating. Just one day without power in New York City costs $1 billion. So within a week or so, the world would be bankrupt. Then the fuel runs out. And the whole time there's global unrest and you want to be away from populated areas, it will be a nightmare. Roving gangs, cartels rising. Now, people in rural areas will fare much better. And they won't notice anything but the power being out. But there'll be similar issues in rural areas, and you need to protect yourself. You'll need to protect your family and your infrastructure. And like I said, it's not a question of if, it's when. And when will we be ready? The one thing we know for sure is that massive events 1,000 times bigger than the Carrington event have occurred in our history. And they will occur again. And as recent, in less than 2 decades ago, we had an X-45 solar flare off the backside of the sun that would have sent us back into the Stone Age. And there are things being done to harden the grid, but not for events of this scale. And that's another thing the world governments are not warning you about. No one is. They're telling you the Earth's going to end because the temperature went up a degree. Can you imagine if they told you that the power grid would be fried and everyone would be in the Stone Age and most of the 80% of the population would be dead within a year? That's something to worry about. In the fact that in previous events where large solar flares hit the Earth, the temperature dropped for hundreds of years, sending us into mini ice age. All thanks to our sun. No, there is no way to protect from a Miyake event. No matter how hardened they make the grid or how resilient, no matter how many transformers we bury, a Miyake event will wipe out our technological empire forever. Now, there will be some novelty. People that have maybe cell phones or computers hidden in Faraday cages, they might make it through. And if you have a solar panel or ways to charge these devices, you could use them. If you've got things downloaded on the device, you could use them. You play games or watch movies maybe. But you couldn't connect to anything. There is a possibility that ham radio operators would be able to communicate, albeit slim. But the world will rebuild. It's not the end of the end. It's the beginning of a new era. And if you've been looking around and seeing what we've been doing to the planet, it's about time for a great reset, and not the Klaus Schwab type. The type where we stop destroying the planet we live on in a runaway capitalistic nightmare that doesn't care about your health or your welfare. It cares about making the 1% richer. They know that this is coming. They have the underground bunkers. They have years of supplies to live comfortably underground. They don't even need to come back up. So that leaves you and I and the rest of humanity to rebuild everything. Will these evil people hold control on the planet after the event? They'll try to. I want to thank y'all for listening and tune in next week for a continuation on Cosmic Catastrophe. We love you. Be safe.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Hello, my name is Mr. Rowe. I am the host of Reality Extraction, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I utilize logic, intellect, and magic to methodically atomize, vivisect, analyze, examine, study, scrutinize, and extract an essence of reality from a fog of illusion and confusion. You can find me on Studio B every Thursday, 1700 hours Pacific Time. That's 8 p.m. Eastern. No topic taboo, no subject too strange. I strive to take a neutral standpoint during the dissection of the topic at hand. That's Reality Extraction with Mr. Rowe on Revolution Radio.
Join me at Revolution Radio, Studio B, at 11 a.m. on Saturday for Free Association, when we take a look at philosophy, spirituality, psychology, social issues, and geopolitics. It's every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern on Studio B at freedomslips.com.